Well, hello again, all my YouTube browsers and subscribers, and if you've just tuned in to Classic Dirt Bike TV for the very first time, I hope you enjoy what you're about to see here on my channel. And if you've just subscribed, then welcome to the family. Now we're heading towards the 11,000 subscribers total, thanks to each and every one of you out there in YouTube land. And don't forget that once you've seen my videos, if you like what you see with regards to its content, then please just hit that like button, or of course better still, just subscribe to my channel. Okay, we've been in the archives once again, and we've dug out another good selection of those old classic race bikes. So enough talk from me, and let's just dive straight in to our first machine. Okay, the first bike out of the video archives is this 1983 RM500 Suzuki, and this is just one of the bikes in Brian Hamilton's collection. Now this is another of those quite rare bikes that you don't see too often these days, probably because these big RM500s were a bit of a handful for your average club rider when they were first launched, and probably also because these particular RM models, it has to be said, wasn't really Suzuki's finest hour. Now this Suzuki motor was really a bored out 465 engine with a 4-speed gearbox, and it was really only put together to try and keep up with the competition at the time of Yamaha, Honda and Kawasaki, who all of course had big bore 500s to compete in the open class motocross events, which were all the rage in the early 1980s. And although the motor was a full-blown 500, it was still pretty mellow and never really came close to the brute power that was supplied by the Honda, Yamaha and Kawasaki bikes. And as I remember, these 500 engines were a bit of a bitch to get the fuel mixture just right when these bikes were first delivered from the factory, and sorting out the 38mm flat slide Mikuni carburetor was an absolute nightmare. But even worse than that, there was no idle circuit built into the carburetor, so you had to be on your guard with the throttle gasser when you went in to those slow turns. Now again, these 83 500s had Suzuki's full floater suspension at the rear with its dual linkage design that let the top and bottom sections of the single shock float independently of each other. But this was a very good setup and worked really well, and it was certainly one of the better features on this bike. Now again, more weight saving by Suzuki here with a magnesium rear brake hub and the use of that alloy square section swing arm. Although to be fair, these RM500s weren't Suzuki's best bike, but it was still a good all-rounder because it had good rear suspension and was quite light for a 500. But if you were a rider with intermediate skills, then the very mellow power delivery of the Suzuki motor would probably have suited you. Although on the flip side, if you're a motocross all-out balls-to-the-wall junkie and power is absolutely everything for your bike, then you'd best opt for a better 480 Honda or 490 Yamaha, which of course had plenty more horses available in the power delivery department. But nevertheless, it's still good to get a look at one of these RM500s in its natural habitat. Okay, next up we're going to take a look at Richard Sharp's very nice 250 CZ twin shocker. Now I can't actually pin down the year of this bike, but it's almost certainly the early 1970s, and it has the look of an original one of these very popular Czechoslovakian racers, and these bikes are becoming even more prominent than Michael's are in this modern day. And as you know, there are a multitude of different variations of these old CZs out there, although these Falta replicas with their alloy gas tanks and leather securing strap are the more sought after models. Now, these Falta CZs were really brought out to honour the success of CZ works rider Jaroslav Falta, who was regarded as a CZ racing icon when he almost won that 1974 world title on a works version of this very bike. Although apart from the handlebars and a different set of rear shocks, this is still a very good example of a Falta replica, and it even still has its original Jikov carburetor that was fitted at the factory. But if we ever get back to some kind of normality in the near future and we can get back to attending these vintage race events once more, then just take a walk through any vintage or classic racing event paddock, and I can almost guarantee that you'll be able to see a very good selection of these old CZs on display, just like this superb example of Richard Sharp's. But if you're lucky enough to own one of these bikes and have one for sale, these machines do fetch very good money, and they also sell very quickly if any come up for sale on the open market. Now, this next bike's another race machine from the Brian Hamilton collection, and this particular CZ250 I think is a late 1980s example, possibly from 1988 or maybe even 1989, although I'm not exactly sure, but it will be there or thereabouts. And I think these were designated the 513 models around that particular period. Now again, this is not an original bike, as Brian's got different shocks and a pattern replacement fuel tank fitted, which of course is plastic, and I'm sure that these 513s had the steel tanks in them back in the day, although that translucent tank is quite a good way of determining how much fuel you've got on board, because you can see the level of the fuel through the sides of the tank. But with regards these 513s and what they were actually like to ride, I don't really know, as there's not a lot of these still being used as racers these days, and this one of Brian's is certainly a rare beastie, well, in Scotland at least. Although I'm not really sure, but I don't think CZ really ever made a bad bike. There were just good ones, and then even better ones, and there were rare bikes as well, like this 513, and of course the Faltas were in there too. But again, how many of these bikes have you seen on a racetrack lately? Very few, I'd wager. And these old CZ engines did have a bit of a reputation for being noisy and sometimes even rattly, but what they lacked in noise suppression they certainly made up for in performance, because these bikes were very quick and they had a great spread of power. But again, a nice little treat to look at one of these old 513 CZs. Okay, next up we are back to the best of British again, as we take a look around Gordon Watson's 1960s BSA Victor. Now, these old Victors are probably regarded as the quintessential racing machine for taking part in pre-1965 scrambles, and unlike the relative rarity of our last bike, these BSAs are seen in their hundreds if you were to visit a classic or vintage scramble event, even here in 2021. Now, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that these BSA motors were a single cylinder 4-stroke with a 2-valve cylinder head. Now, I'm sure that the bore and the stroke on these engines was around the 79mm by 90mm range, but feel free to correct me on that point if it's not right. Now, they also had a dry sump in the motor, which of course meant that the oil for the engine was stored in the frame and then pumped around the engine before returning it back to the chassis, but it was a very innovative idea and a quite reliably tried and tested system. Now again, no rear silencer as such, just a straight through exhaust header pipe that bolted onto a very short open pipe just at the side of the carburetor airbox. Now Gordon's motor's also been fitted with the upgraded external oil filter cartridge system, which filters the motor's engine oil through an external cartridge and a series of oil feed pipes. And this is a much better invention than the silly little gauze filter system that was originally built into the bottom of the bike's chassis. And as I recall, I think the frame held about 3 litres of engine lubricant, but it was still a great idea to use the frame as an oil storage tank. Now you can see here that Gordon's Victors had a new pair of billet alloy triple clamps fitted to replace the originals, and that unmistakable BSA Victor alloy fuel tank, I think it could store around just under 2 gallons of gas. Now, as you'd expect on a British built scrambler, the original shocks have been swapped for these Dutch made Riger shocks, which are very good quality and very popular with these old classic racers. Now again, drum brakes as you'd expect for the late 1960s time period, and these were good enough to slow you sufficiently for the tons when they were needed, although shutting the throttle on this old BSA thumper had about exactly the same effect. But another good example of one of these BSA Victors, and a little bit of nostalgia from back in the day. Now this was a very unusual bike that I spotted at a Scottish Classic Scramble a few years back, and it's a 250 or possibly even a 350 Honda 4-stroke motor that's been slotted into a Husqvarna 2-stroke frame. Now I never really got any details about the bike because often when I film these machines the owners are seldom around for comment, although it does look like the bottom frame rails have been dropped down to accommodate that bigger and taller Honda motor. But I have to say the entire bike certainly looks like it's been well engineered and thought out, and it also looks like a new alloy airbox has been fabricated on it as well. But if you're interested, I'm sure there'll be some racing footage on YouTube of this bike on the track, and if you search Scottish Classic Racing Kirkness 2015, you may just catch a glimpse of this bike in action. But it's a little cracker and quite an unusual combination of the Husqvarna chassis and the Honda 4-banger motor, and the owners obviously had his reasons why he chose this particular pairing, but then again he may have just had an old Husky frame lying around and a spare Honda motor, and then just decided on putting them both together as a winter project. But for me personally, I quite like this combination of the Husky frame and this nice Honda 4-banger motor, and I have to say that you have to give the owner credit for coming up with the idea in the first place, and also thanks to him for giving us something slightly different to share with all my YouTubers here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. Well, I hope you enjoyed that latest batch of dirt bikes from my video archives, and don't forget, if you enjoy the content that I'm posting here on my YouTube channel, then please hit that like button, or of course better still, just subscribe to my channel. Okay, coming up in my next video, we'll be back into the video vault once again, and we'll dig out more of those classics that I know you love to watch. And coming up in my next video, we'll be taking a look at this very nice 1981 490 Michael belonging to Rob Weldon. and also we'll be having a gander at this lovely little YZ125 Yamaha that I spotted at the Telford show in 2020. So I do hope you'll all return to take a look at those. So once again, thanks for taking the time to tune in to my channel, and we'll speak again very soon when we all return to Classic Dirt Bike TV.